Welcome everyone to this, the first in our Humane Philosophy Project Ian Ramsey Centre seminar series 2019 to 2020. It's amazing we've been doing these so long now. I have to really think hard to remember what year it is. I'm really pleased this evening to welcome Martin Pickup, who is the Turpin Junior Research Fellow at Oriel College. He's a metaphysician and a philosopher of religion, and he's going to talk to us today about divine locatedness. So please give him a very warm welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to be with you this evening, and thank you all for being here. I'm looking forward to having a conversation. As Ralph said, my topic is divine locatedness, or in particular the question, where is God, divine presence and location? Just a couple of things to say right at the beginning. The first is, I think there's probably a bit of variation across the room in terms of background in contemporary analytic philosophy, so I'm going to try not to assume very much. I might fail at that because I end up talking most of the time to people who do have a lot of background in that. And if so, please feel free to stop me and ask me to repeat something or to go over something a little bit more clearly if I'm saying things in a way that isn't immediately obvious to you. That will be a benefit to me and to the rest of the group as well, I should think. Secondly, well, we'll get to secondly later. Okay, I'll just launch in. Hopefully things will become a bit more apparent. This is kind of a work in progress, so I'll be interested to know your thoughts on it. Okay, so I'll just move this slightly behind, if I may. This is the motivating question of the talk for this evening. Where is God? The reason this question became particularly vivid to me was because about a year ago, my then three-year-old son kept asking me, where is God? And those of you who've encountered inquisitive 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds might realise that they're not easily palmed off with not very satisfying answers. So this required me to think a little bit more deeply about what's going on. Now, of course, I didn't give him this talk because I haven't finished it yet. But maybe once I finally get to a perfected version, this might go some way to answering that question. But it's a question not only for 3- and 4-year-olds, but also for philosophers and theologians, and people have thought about it for a long time. And this is my small contribution to an ongoing discussion. Now, there are a number of things that different people say, different philosophers and theologians say, and different people within different religious traditions about the question of where is God and about the question of God's location and presence. One thing, which is what I'm going to be focusing on today, is omnipresence, which is the claim that God is, in some sense, everywhere. God is present everywhere. That's what we're going to be focusing on today. But I thought I'd just point out for you at the beginning that there are a number of other related questions which are interestingly different but have some sort of connection here. One, these are 3 examples which I'm picking out of the Christian context. One is the Incarnation. It seems like traditional Christianity, at least, is going to say something like God is especially present or most clearly located or something like that in Jesus Christ, in the person of Jesus Christ. God is present in Jesus in a special sort of way. Well, what can that mean? That's going to depend slightly on what we mean by God being present more generally. The real presence of Christ in the Eucharist is a doctrine that Roman Catholics and a number of other Christian denominations adhere to, which says that Christ is in some sense really present on the altar after consecration. So when we go to church and we have some stuff up on the altar which is originally bread and wine, later on this is somehow the real presence of Christ. And it's obvious that that's referring in some sense here to God's presence in a special way. A final example, although there are more, is the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. A claim that's often made in the Christian tradition is that in some contexts, in some sense, the Holy Spirit is present in believers in a religious community when they're doing certain sorts of things together. The Holy Spirit can indwell in us. And indwelling is a form of being present. So, as I say, we'll be focusing on omnipresence, but I'm just flagging for you that there's some interesting other connections here in the question of where God is. So what's my overall goal? Well, today what I'm going to be trying to do, or this evening, is to explore how work in pure metaphysics in the contemporary debate can shed some light on the possibilities of what we might want to say within certain religious denominations about God's location and presence. So that is, I'm going to be taking the resources of contemporary analytic philosophy, particularly in the area of metaphysics, and trying to apply them to some questions in religious or theological domains. And this is an instance of what's this new movement called analytic theology. It maybe isn't quite as new as some people think it is, but it's an analytic theology approach where we use the resources of analytic philosophy to try and do some theology. So this, if you've heard of that term or if you haven't, would be one example of it that might help you to understand. If it's a good example, I'm not sure, but might help you to understand what the project is in analytic theology. Okay, so the motivating issue, the motivating problem. In Western theism, generally, God is said to be omnipresent. God is said to be everywhere. But what exactly does this mean? There are a number of different alternatives, two of which are particularly salient here. One is that, and this option is one taken by a number of well-known people, including Aquinas and Augustine, I think, and several others, and Swinburne. God is analogically located everywhere. That is to say, God is in some sense everywhere, but not literally. And that analogical sense can be cashed out in a number of different ways. We might say that God is everywhere, or related to every place, through being able to control what's happening everywhere, or through knowing what's happening everywhere, or through acting everywhere. Even though God isn't literally in those places, God is said to be in those places because God has power or knowledge or control or action or all of those in those places. But there's a number of questions about this, but one is just, well, is this really presence? I've already said really that it isn't, right? Because it's not literal presence. So God is not literally everywhere. And if you wanted to try and hold on to the idea that God is omnipresent in a more robust and literal sense, then this isn't the right way to go. Now, I'm not going to really put pressure on this view. I'm just flagging it to you as an alternative. What I'm going to be concentrating on in this talk is a second option. God is literally located at every place. So for every region of space you can think of, and even those you can't think of, God is there. God is literally located there. But this too faces some problems. A number of different problems. It seems to clash with a number of different properties that are traditionally ascribed to God in Western theism, like the claim that God is simple. If God is simple, that means God has no parts. But if God is everywhere, well, that means God's over there, and over here, and over there. So doesn't that mean that God's got a part over there, a part here, and a part over there? If so, then it looks like God's not going to be simple. And there are worries too about some of God's other properties, like God supposedly being immaterial and transcendent and unconstrained in various ways. These are topics that we're going to come back to later in the talk. But I'm just flagging for you right now that there's some worries, some initial worries about the claim that God is literally present everywhere. So the question for someone who believes this, people like Hud Hudson and Ross Inman and others, is how to make sense of God's traditional properties, like these, within a model where God is literally present in every place. Okay, so I'm now going to give you a couple of my aims for the rest of the talk. The central aim is this one, to make progress on a viable literal interpretation of the claim that God is everywhere. So this is going to be within that second option that I gave to you, trying to make some progress on making that sound coherent and sensible. That's not to say I'm committed to that view, but I think we should try and work out what the best version of that view is. So that's our central aim. And I've got a few subsidiary aims which I'm not going to concentrate on, but I'm hoping that we might sort of shed some light on in passing. The first is that I'm going to outline for you some recent developments of the literal interpretation, which use the formal machinery of the metaphysics of location that has been developed independently in the metaphysics literature. So that's kind of going to be to give you some background. Another thing that I'm hoping to do in passing is to improve on the current views, as I've kind of just said, and I'll do that by introducing a new notion within the theories of location, a new primitive location, which I'll reveal for you later on in the talk. So I'm not going to say too much about it now, so hopefully you'll still be on tenterhooks later. You probably won't be, but I've got to console myself with that thought. And finally, as I said in the first slide, this talk and the way that I'm deploying the resources of contemporary analytic metaphysics to answer and address these questions can be seen as a sort of example of the approach of analytic theology. So I want to sort of showcase how analytic theology can work and what it might be able to do in one context to give a sense of what its power might be in other contexts. But don't worry, analytic theology's power doesn't depend just on what I'm able to do today. There's lots of other good analytic theology out there, better than mine. Okay, right, so I'm going to now give you an outline of what the rest of the talk is going to be, so you can keep track of where we're at. So the first half is going to be scene setting. I'm going to do what a lot of analytic philosophers like to do by making lots of ground-clearing claims and distinctions in the first section to tell you what I am and am not talking about. This might be a little bit boring for you, but if you're trained in the tradition, it probably makes you feel quite at home. Then I'm going to talk about this notion of location in contemporary metaphysics, which, as I say, has been independently developed. And then I'm going to talk about the existing application to omnipresence. That's the first half of the talk. In the second half of the talk, I'm going to move beyond what's existing in the literature and make a new proposal about how we should talk about God being literally everywhere. And that's by introducing, as I said earlier, this primitive locational relation, this primitive relation of location, which is collocation. I'm going to spend some time talking about what that means. And once I've told you what that means, I'm going to use it to try and give an account of what omnipresence is, which avoids some of the issues that arise for other accounts. And finally, I'm going to draw some conclusions. Does that all sound okay? Does anyone want to flag anything that's been massively incoherent so far? I'm not going to give you many of these options, particularly as it gets more controversial. Okay, good. Right, so we're going to start with this clearing the ground stage. So the options that I'm going to be considering about God's omnipresence are going to be constrained by Christian theology. I'm hoping that what I have to say would be of interest to people who are not constrained by Christian theology but still want to make something like the omnipresence claim. But I'm not going to be trying to capture everybody because there are certain issues that arise which I'm more familiar with in the Christian context, so I'm not going to try and cover everything. But I hope that what I have to say has further applications more widely than that. And if you're not Christian or not interested in Christianity, you can still think of this as an interesting case study in how to think about these sorts of questions on maybe their maximally plausible variety. Or at least that's what I'm hoping. Okay. I'm also largely going to be ignoring some big picture discussions which exist in metaphysics and in philosophy about the nature of space, the nature of time, and the nature of space-time. That's because these are really complicated and detailed issues which aren't going to touch that much or have that much of an effect on what I'm trying to say. They will, in a couple of places, make a difference, and I'll flag those. And maybe you'll think that they make a difference in more areas than I've noticed, in which case I'd be grateful for you pointing those out. But I'm not going to spend any time in the talk really talking about these sorts of distinctions or arguments for certain sorts of views on the nature of space. Okay, and finally, I'm going to be moving reasonably quickly to try and keep a lot of interesting content in here rather than going slowly and methodically. And that means I'm going to skate over some things a little bit fast. Again, I'll be happy and grateful if you were to pick me up on anything you think I've skated over too quickly in the Q&A. But I am happy, I say, to discuss details, as long as they're not like totally crippling. And even then, probably in the interest of the pursuit of truth, I probably would ultimately be happy, just maybe not straight away. Okay, so let's go on to this introduction of these formal notions of location. So as I've said, metaphysicians have recently been interested in spelling out relations of location or occupation between objects and places. So it seems like objects have locations. So the table is in the room, for instance, or the table is in that part of space. And metaphysicians have, for the last 10, 15 years, been particularly interested in thinking about how to make sense of those sorts of claims, formally speaking. And these formal accounts often use notions which are drawn from pre-existing discussions of parts and wholes, of parthood, like the claim that, for instance, the top of the desk is part of the whole desk. Because thinking about it, those sorts of claims look like they might have something to do with claims about where the desk is, right? The top half of the desk might be somewhere that all of the desk is only partly, and those sorts of claims, right? So parthood and location look like they're going to be interestingly related. And in these formal accounts, which we're going to be talking about, people tend to use the resources developed in Materiality to start to think about the relationship between objects and where those objects are, objects and their locations. And what they're focused on is this located at relation, the relation of being at, that holds between an object and a place, where a place here is usually understood to be a region of space. And for those of you who are familiar with this terminology, they mean by that something like a substantival region of space. Space is an independently existing entity. So there's a relationship here which is being investigated between objects and the places those objects are, between portions of space and material things. So that's what people have been interested in looking at recently, or at least in this particular literature I'm referring to. So I'm now going to give you an example of one way of talking about these relations. And I'm not going to go through it in detail, but just to give you a flavour of the sorts of things people are interested in. This is from Josh Parsons. So I'll talk about a couple maybe of these definitions just to get a sense of what's going on. So X here is an object, and R is a region of space. So you can see there's all these different versions of location, different sorts of location. And they're going to be mutually interdefined using each other and using some notions of parthood and things like that. So X is weakly located at a region R if R is not completely free of X. So to give you some examples, I am weakly located in this room because this room is not completely free of me. By this room, strictly speaking, I mean the region of space which this room corresponds to. But even if I went and put myself half in the corridor and half in the room, I would still be weakly located in the room because the room isn't completely free of me, right? There's still some of me in the room. And similarly, the region of space that, say, this portion of matter here, as I step into it, that's not completely free of me now, right? Even though I'm bigger than it, right? So that's the notion of weak location. There's other sorts of notions of location, like, for instance, being entirely located at a region. That means the region is not completely free of you, but there's no other region which has any of you in. Right? So you're entirely located within that region. Pervasive location is, so an object is pervasively located at a region if there's no portion of that region which doesn't have the X in it. So an example of that would be something like the region that's here and me, or my body at least, right? So if you draw a line around my body, that region is going to be pervaded by me because I'm all of it. There's none of it it doesn't have some of me in it. Anyway, as I say, I'm not dwelling on these, and these aren't the particular details of these cases aren't going to matter for later. But I'm giving you an example of a flavour of what's going on when people are starting to talk about location in these terms. And then, as you can see, there's some other notions of location which are defined as well. One interesting thing to note is that the way this version is done by Josh Parsons, you start with weak location, and then you define everything else in terms of weak location and things like parthood. But actually, you can do it the other way around. You can start, for instance, with exact location. Your exact location is where you are pervasively and also where all of you is. So the example I gave earlier of the region, if you were to draw around my body, it's not just pervasive location, it's actually my exact location. It's exactly where I am. And you can define all these others if you start with exactly located. But you have to start with one of them as your primitive, which you don't get to explain in terms of the others. And then you explain all the others in terms of that one. And that's going to be relevant for later. And it actually matters which of these you choose for reasons I won't go into, because certain things are possible on one primitive, but not possible on another. So it depends which primitive you choose can have some consequences for what's possible and what's not possible. And again, that's going to be relevant later. Okay. So that's a kind of introduction to what this formal notion of location is doing in the literature. Now let's talk about omnipresence. There are two different ways that an object can occupy a region of space. One of these is going to be very familiar, and the other is going to sound a bit weird. Okay? So the familiar one is the first sense, although it's an unfamiliar word, pertension. Right? So an object, A, pertends a region R, if and only if A is wholly located in that region and has a part wholly located at every part of that region. Let me give you an example. So let's go back to me and the region that's, the outline of the region of space that's where I am. So I pretend that region of space. Why is that? Well, because I'm wholly located at that region, and for any part of that region, like this one, there's a part of me that's there, right? But not all of me. It's only my hand that's there. The rest of me isn't. And similarly with my foot. I wasn't intending to dance, but I can. Okay, so that's the normal way that objects occupy space. But there's an unusual way that some people claim objects can occupy space. And this is called intension. So an object A intends a region R, if and only if. That object A is wholly located at R and wholly located at every part of R. So what that would be like would be, let's go back to the region that I'm in and me. That would be like this region having all of me in, not just my hand. Now that's quite a difficult and counterintuitive concept to get one's head around. A possible example of this, and it doesn't really matter whether it's a real example or not, because I'm trying to make this conceptual distinction. So if you think of a universal like redness, you might think that a red wall, the redness of the red wall, is wholly present in any brick of the wall, in any part of the wall, right? All of the redness is in any part of the wall. So although it's true that the redness is located at the region of space where the wall is, any part of the region where the wall is will also have all of the redness. It's not like by adding together different bricks of the wall, you get more redness. I mean, maybe you do get more redness in one sense, you get a larger region of space which is red, but you don't get more redness, right? So all of the redness is there in any part of the wall, or any part of the region of space where the wall is. Now, as I say, that might be a controversial example depending on your view of properties and so on, but it gives you a sense of what's supposed to be happening when objects intend regions. Now, some people, Hud Hudson, Alex Bruce and Ross Inman, among others, have used this notion of intention to give a novel account of what it is for God to be omnipresent, for God to be everywhere. They say, as you might be able to put the pieces together already, that what God does is God is omnipresent by wholly occupying every spatial region, i.e., God is intending everywhere. God intends everywhere. God wholly occupies every single point or region of space. So it's not that God is a little bit over here and a little bit over there, as I was mentioning earlier, as could be a concern, right? Oh, there's God's over there and here, so isn't part of God over there and part of God over there and part of God here? The answer that Ross Inman and Hud Hudson and Alex Bruce give is no, because God's relationship to space is different to the way that we, for instance, relate to space. God is in space by being wholly present at each point in space. So all of God is over there, and all of God is here, and all of God is over there. And that solves at least some of the issues. That solves, in particular, the simplicity problem, and maybe some others too. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at the moment in terms of this literal interpretation of God's presence, God's omnipresence. But there are some problems with this view. It solves some problems, but it doesn't solve them all. And I'm going to give you 4 of the problems. The first is that things located at regions are usually depend on those regions for their existence, or at least depend on them in some sense, right? If the region where I am didn't exist, then, well, I couldn't be here, could I? But that sounds pretty bad in the case of God in a standard Christian context, because we don't want God to depend on anything. We don't want God to depend on space in particular. And if God is related to space in this way, in the same way, intention, pertension, difference aside, in the same sort of way that objects exist in space, then it looks like God might depend on space. And that will be bad for various different views about God's lack of dependence on anything, let alone regions of space. Secondly, normally we would say that objects which are at a region inherit certain sorts of properties from those regions, or at least share those properties with those regions. Like, for instance, if the region I'm at is, say, 5'11", or long, then that means I'm going to be exactly at, then that means I'm going to be 5'11" tall. If the region that this is at is, well, that's a bad example because it's not an easily describable shape. If the region that the top of the table is at is rectangular, then the table's rectangular, right? There's certain sorts of topological and spatial properties of regions that get inherited by the objects which are at them, or at least shared with them. But then we don't want to say that God has a certain size and shape or certain topological properties, even if the topology is that of the entirety of space, say. We don't want God to have any sort of spatial or topological properties, or at least that seems to me a plausible claim. A third worry is about materiality. So God is typically taken to be immaterial, but materiality is also often defined in terms of location in space. If you're located in space, you're material. If you're not located in space, you're not material. And in this view, God is located in space. So does that mean God's material? Now, that might not be sort of an overwhelming problem, but it's at least something to be puzzled about. So is God material on this view? Finally, of the examples I'm going to give you of problems, the relationship between God and space in this case is the same as the relationship between ordinary things and space, setting aside the distinction between per tension and end tension, which won't matter for the fundamental relationship between God and space. But normally we want to think of God in the Christian tradition as being transcendent in some sense. And typically that sense would involve God not having the same relationship to space that objects do. Now, I don't think any of these four problems don't have responses. Maybe there are ways to respond to this on behalf of the people that I'm challenging. But that's not what I want to focus on. I want to focus on a different way of going and see whether we can simply avoid these challenges rather than having to respond to them. Okay, so we've now got through the existing material and we're moving on to this new proposal. So, let me give you some introduction to this notion of collocation we're going to be talking about. So, formal theories of location, which I discussed earlier, what they're focusing on is talking about the relationship between a region and a material object, as I've said. And what they do, as I also said, is they take different locational relations as primitive and define other ones in terms of that. What I think we should be looking for independent reasons for a more general notion of location than just the relationship between regions of space and material objects. And here are some reasons that we might want to do that, independent of what we want to say or don't want to say about God's omnipresence. The first is that, as I sort of flagged in passing, if we're talking about regions and material objects, normally in this context we talk about regions as being substantival, by which I mean sort of existing independently of any objects. But that's a very controversial assumption in the philosophy of space and time. Lots of people think that space and time should be thought of as relational, that is, depending on the objects which exist in space and time. But that's not going to work if we're talking about relations between these things as being fundamental. Right? You can only have fundamental relationships between fundamental things, and if regions of space are not fundamental, they can't stand in fundamental relations, at least plausibly. So it would be nice if we weren't committed to substantivalism about space. Secondly, it seems like location relations can hold between different sorts of things, not just between regions and material objects. And I've got a couple of examples here. It might be nice if you could think of other ones. The wine is in the fridge, right? The wine and the fridge are both objects. This is a location relation between objects, not between an object and a region. Red and green are throughout the pattern. Red and green here are going to be, I don't know, maybe universals. It depends on your theory of properties, but something like universals maybe. And the pattern could either be maybe that's referring to a material object, like the pattern out there on the rug, or maybe it's referring to something abstract, like, the thing of which the rug is an example. But either way, we're not here having a relationship between a material object and a region of space. So it seems like we can talk sensibly about location of and occupation relations which don't involve material objects and regions. So what I want to do is see where we can go and what we can do if we start with a different, more generic primitive notion. And this notion is collocation, I'm going to tell you what I mean by that in the next slide. So that's the motivation for looking for a different primitive. Now, this is a bit of a cheap shot, but it's true. So if collocation is going to be a primitive in the system that I'm developing, I can't define it for you. Because that's what it means for something to be a primitive, is that it can't be defined in other terms. But that doesn't mean I get away completely scot-free, right? Because I need to give you some sort of grip on the notion and the concept that I'm reaching for. And so here's a gloss of what I mean by collocation. So two or more things are collocated when they are at zero distance from one another. Okay, so two or more things are collocated when they're at zero distance from one another. And that's kind of a way to try and get a grip on the notion of collocation that I'm after. Now, it's important that this is not the same as, and I don't want, either of these following two different ways of describing something like collocation. The first, it would be being in the same place as. Two things are collocated when they're in the same place. That's not what I mean. And the second is that two things are collocated when they have all the same spatial relations. And again, that's not what I mean. And if you're interested in why, I can tell you a bit more about it later in the Q&A. But basically, these two cases rule out certain sorts of scenarios like multi-location that this one doesn't. And I want to keep hold of those possibilities. So when I say collocated, you can think at zero distance from. Now let me give you some examples to hopefully make it a bit clearer what collocation is supposed to be and do. So I'm collocated with the region that my body occupies. Okay? Those two things are collocated. And that's basically the same relation as exact location, as we'll talk about later. Two perfectly interpenetrated objects are collocated. Perfectly interpenetrated objects are objects which are, let's think about it like this, two objects which can sort of go through each other, and they move towards each other. They're the same shape, the same size, and then when they get to the point at which you can't see beyond, you can only see one thing effectively, then you've got two perfectly interpenetrated objects. Okay? Interpenetration might not be physically possible, but it seems like we can imagine it. Okay? So two perfectly interpenetrated objects would be collocated in this sense. Thirdly, an immanent universal would be collocated with the object instantiating it. So redness would be collocated with the red wall, and also presumably each part of the red wall. And finally, some of you might be familiar with these statue and lump type cases where it looks like you've got two material objects in the same place. A sculptor makes a statue out of a lump of clay, and it looks like according to some views, it looks like you've got two things. You've got a lump of clay and you've got a statue, and they're not the same thing for various reasons, which I won't go into. If that's true, which I'm not sure about, but if that's true, then you'd have two material objects which would be collocated. Okay, so these are examples to give you a sense of what collocation is supposed to be. Now, some examples of things which are not collocated, because sometimes people say this is an example of something, and they don't tell you what's an example of something which isn't that way, and I find that quite difficult to follow. So I'm not collocated with any region on Mars, right? We're just not collocated. That should be pretty obvious. Samuel's not collocated with the door. In fact, he's sitting right back there. So he's not where the door is. He and the door are not collocated. And finally, the number 3 is not collocated with that chair. Why is that? Well, you might. I point this one out because you might think, well, it's not at any distance from it because maybe it's abstract. But it's also not at zero distance, right? Because 0 is a defined distance. And given that the number 3 is not in space, it's abstract, it's not at any distance from the chair rather than being 0 distance from the chair. That distinction won't really matter, but it'll help you get a grip on what the notion is. Okay, so collocation is a more general type of relation that can hold between different sorts of things, including between objects and regions. And when it holds between an object and a region, it's going to just be exact location. Okay, so exact location is a particular type of relation of which this is a more general type. So collocation is a more general type of location for different sorts of things of which exact location is a type. Right. This is all a bit dense, isn't it? But we're getting somewhere, I promise you. So the properties of the collocation relation. So here's some formal properties of the relation for those of you that mind about these things. It's reflexive, symmetric, and non-transitive. So that means that everything is collocated with itself, that should be obvious. And if A is co-located with B, then B is co-located with A. Again, that should be obvious. This one is not obvious. At least I didn't find it obvious. If A is co-located with B and B is co-located with C, that doesn't mean that A is co-located with C. You might think that it would, but it doesn't for reasons that will become apparent very shortly. Okay? So it's not transitive. It might be co-located. A might be co-located with C if they're both co-located with B, but it doesn't have to be. And I've got an appendix, because that's the sort of thing I like to do. Actually, that's not true. I don't normally do appendices. Which shows how you can have a formal definition of the other properties that Parsons, for instance, gave in terms of this co-location notion. And if you're really interested, we can work our way through that in the Q&A. But you maybe aren't as interested as I am. So I deny that if A and B are co-located, then A and B share all of their spatial properties. Okay, so if A and B are co-located, that doesn't mean that they have all the same spatial properties. And here's an example to show why that's the case. Suppose you had a multiply located object, an object that's wholly located in more than one place. An example of this might be someone who traveled back in time to a time where they'd earlier existed, right? You go back and meet yourself as a baby. I'm not saying that can happen. I'm saying this is a way of getting hold of the concept. If you did that, you'd be wholly located in more than one place, right? Where the thing was going goo goo gaga and where the thing was going, oh my God, I can't believe I was that small. Or cute, or, well, I'm not sure I would think that of myself. But okay, so, and why is that relevant? Because if you have multiply located objects, right, then the object over here, which is wholly over here, will have certain spatial relations. And the very same object, also wholly located over here, will have different spatial relations. So the very same object can have different spatial relations even when two things are co-located. Because the region where the older Martin or the baby Martin are will have certain spatial relations that Martin won't necessarily have. Because Martin's going to have more than the region of space will. And that's also why we don't have transitivity. So if the older me is co-located with a particular region of space, and that region of space is, if a certain region of space is co-located with me, and I am co-located with some other region of space, because baby me is co-located with that region of space, and adult me is co-located with that one, these two can still be not co-located, because they're different, right? Different spaces. Shall I say that again?
No.
Yeah. Okay, so suppose here that B is me, right? And I'm the time traveler. So there's a region of space, say in the cot, which is co-located with me, because, a particular part of the cot is co-located with me, because that's where baby me is, right? And then I, adult me, am located somewhere else, say across the room, a different region of space across the room. The region of space in the cot and the region of space across the room are not co-located with each other, okay? Because I am wholly located in two different places. This isn't going to matter greatly, but, technical precision and so on. Okay, so now let's come back to the question of omnipresence. And as you might be able to guess, my interpretation of omnipresence is going to be ubiquitous collocation. So what I think we should consider as a possibility anyway is that to say God is omnipresent is to say that God bears the collocation relation to everything. God is collocated with everything. So if there are regions of space, God will be co-located with every region of space. But if there are no regions of space, well, God's not going to be co-located with them. But God is also co-located with every single entity, right? So for everything that there is, God is co-located with that thing. You might not think that sounds very different to the views that we've been talking about so far, but I think it is importantly different because it deals with some problems. So let's dwell on this for a second, though. God is co-located with everything. So that means God is at zero distance from everything. And everything, because the relation is symmetric, is also at zero distance from God. That's quite a nice thought, I think, for other reasons. Okay, so that's quite a nice way of expressing what I think is the underlying motivation for omnipresence. Now notice this is a genuine location relation. Collocation is a genuine location relation. So there is a literal sense in which God is everywhere. right? We've defined location as using our primitive of collocation. So it's literally the case that God is everywhere. But it's not the same notion as exact location, right? So it's not that God bears the same relationship to space that material objects do. And that's going to help us in various ways. So I've got 2 slides where I try and talk about the advantages of this view. The first is a set of sort of broad advantages. So God is co-located with everything, and that means God is present to everything and everywhere. That sounds good to me. And that's better than the Swinburne Aquinas type view, arguably, where God is only analogically present to everything and everywhere. I'm a bit wary of saying that this is better than a view of Aquinas', but we'll scrap that from the recording. But also God's relation to space can be different to ours, unlike the other view, which has previously been discussed, where God is literally everywhere by bearing the very same sort of relation to space that material objects do. So it's kind of a middle way. And also it's not committed to substantivalism about space, where space exists over and above the material objects that occupy it. And so this view works with relativism about space, which we might want for other reasons. And now I'm going to go back to the 4 criticisms that I quickly raised against the previous n-tension model and show how they don't affect this view. The first is dependence. So remember that we were worried about if God's relationship to space is the same as objects' relationship to space, then God's going to depend on space. That sounds bad. But collocation, unlike the relationship of exact location, is symmetric. That means that things bear it in both directions and to each other. So that means there's no particular dependence notions that follow from bearing a co-location relation to something. Okay? Unlike exact location, where then there's a dependence because it's asymmetric. There was an inheritance worry that, well, doesn't this mean that God's going to get certain sort of topological or properties like having a certain size or shape or whatever? Well, collocation doesn't entail inheriting spatial properties because it's a relation that can hold between not just regions and material objects, but between, say, 2 material objects or a universal and a material object. So there's no obvious reason why anything standing in a collocation relation would inherit any spatial or topological properties. So God needn't have any sorts of properties like these. Thirdly, materiality. There was a worry that one of the things we want to say is that God is immaterial, but one way of defining materiality is that to say that something is material when it has a location in space. Well, on the collocation view, there's no reason that being collocated with something implies being material. Exact location implies that because it involves relationship to a region. But suppose there are no regions, for instance, if you're a relationalist about space, then there'll be no reason for thinking that being co-located with a material object implies being located in space. So there's more flexibility here. Now, you could, both for inheritance and materiality, you could say that you do get inheritance and materiality with co-location, but you needn't. And in this context, we wouldn't want to. Finally, transcendence. So collocation is a generic notion of which, as I've said, exact location is a type. And that means that God's type of collocation could be different from the type of collocation that holds between entities and regions, which is exact location. And that means God can be, in an important sense, transcendent, because the relationship between God and space, or God and objects, is not the same as the relationship between objects and space, because they have their own certain sort of version of collocation, which is exact location, and maybe God has a different sort of version of collocation. Okay, now all of that hopefully has made you think, wow, this is such a great view, it's so plausible, everyone should hold this view, Martin, well done. But you're probably not, I recognize that. But I still think there are some remaining questions that, in the interest of being honest, I ought to flag. So one is that I'm worried about how ad hoc this relation of collocation being primitive is. That's something to think about further. Is it ad hoc to have this generic notion of collocation? As I suggested, there are some independent reasons for wanting something like it, so maybe not, but I'm still a little bit concerned that it feels a bit like an ad hoc move. Secondly, the properties of the relation are doing some interesting work for me, but I've just kind of stipulated what properties it has. So how ad hoc is it to say that the collocation relation has these properties rather than some other properties? It would be nice to know what it is about collocation that leads to it having certain sorts of properties and not others. Thirdly, isn't collocation a kind of mysterious notion? We've got maybe a better handle on what exact location is, or even weak location, in terms of which we can define exact location. Do we really have an independent grip on the notion of collocation? I sort of think so, but I'm not sure. And maybe that's because I've been spending a lot of time writing this paper, and you guys haven't. So I'd be interested to know what you think. And finally, this is kind of a remaining question which isn't necessarily critical, but could this collocation notion help with some of the other ways in which we want to talk about divine presence that I flagged at the beginning, like, for instance, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist? That's a longer-term project that I'm interested in. So can collocation help with some other things we might want to say in the Christian tradition and in other traditions about divine location? Okay, just some final conclusions, and we're nearly done. So some recent work on location allows interesting defenses, I claim, of the literal interpretations of omnipresence. But I think we do even better than that by seeing that the metaphysical work on location is work on a type of locative relation, a particular type of locative relation between regions and material objects. And then defining a more general notion of collocation, which is a more general locative relation, which is more permissive and allows relationships between different types of things than just regions and material objects. And if we define this notion of collocation, I think we can get an account of omnipresence, of the literal omnipresence of God in every part of space, that solves some of the problems that continue to exist for the existing literal interpretations of omnipresence. And there are some references for you. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks very much, Martin, for that really lucid talk. We have plenty of time for questions, and I can see there's already some questions in the audience. Well, we'll start with this question here and then move to Andrew. And go ahead. Oh, and sorry, I should say, do allow me to bring you the microphone when you ask a question.
Thanks for that talk. I'm slightly surprised that you talk about collocation and you never mention time. That's one thing. And the second thing is you never defined God. You've been talking about this all night and you didn't tell us what God is. And then if you did that, then I would think we would have many explanations. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are two very good questions. So I think I'll start with the second one and then do the first one afterwards. So you're quite right that I didn't define God before launching into talking about God's relationship with space. And that might seem like a bit of an oversight. In fact, it's sort of deliberate because, well, for two reasons. The first is that if to start out on the project one had to get a really good grip on the notion of God first, which might be the case, then I think the project would be very, very difficult to carry to completion. But the second is, sort of in virtue of that, I was trying to piggyback on existing notions of what God is within the Christian tradition. And that's why I said what I was going to be talking about was constrained by, in particular, Christian theological reflection, but more generally, Western theism. So if you want to get a handle on the sort of thing, maybe not the precise thing because I haven't nailed down the details, but the sort of thing that God is going to be referring to in a talk like this from me, it's going to be talking about the God of traditional Western theism. Now, of course, there are questions about what that is, but those are questions that I was hoping not to have to engage with in order to present this material. And the first question was about time, and this never happens, but I'm really pleased to be able to say I have some slides on time, which I actually cut out of the talk for reasons of space and because I wasn't sure quite how relevant it was, because yeah, I didn't have time, right, quite, so I didn't include time. Nice. So I won't go through the slides, but the basic point I want to say is that there's an interesting parallel between debates about whether God is literally in space or only analogically in space, and questions about whether God is literally in time or only analogically in time. And people differ on that question. there's people on both sides, people who say that God is outside of time and people who say that God is inside of time. And one interesting thing that I drew on in kind of getting inspiration for this talk was looking at people who talk about God being outside of time, but God somehow still being simultaneous with events in time. And Stump and Kretzmann are the people who developed this notion of ET simultaneity, which you can look up if you're interested in. They want to say that God is simultaneous with everything happening in time, but in a different way to the way that objects within time are simultaneous, or events within time are simultaneous with each other. And it's that sort of general move from something that happens in the world to a more general relation of which it's a type, which is the same sort of move that I'm trying to make in the space case. So you're quite right that there's a connection to the temporal stuff here. And I want to, again, try and find some sort of middle path. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to have such clear thinking, and I felt the whole ground's being cleared beautifully and beautifully presented. Thank you for all that. One issue that's going to occur to people like myself is the issue of personal presence. So your talk is inspired, if you like, by the Cartesian paradigm we've been living through the last few centuries. But there's the issue of personal presence. So the first question to Adam after the fall in the story of Genesis is, where are you? Now clearly God is co-located with Adam's presence in space, but there's another whole dimension of presence here that's missing. And I just want to make a suggestion to you, because Stump has done a lot of work on this more recently than the paper you cited there. So Wandering in Darkness. And she talks about the many ways in which someone can be present or not present to another person. So when you're writing your book, that's just an allusion at least, or maybe a chapter on this topic will be a good addition. So thank you very much.
Great, thanks. No, that's a really helpful suggestion. I have Wandering in Darkness sitting on the shelf alongside other books that I want to read, and its size is, although people tell me it's brilliant, and I know it's brilliant, its size is somewhat intimidating, but I will get around to it one day. But no, I think that's a really important point, because I think there are a number of different notions of presence. Only one of them is this kind of, maybe more literal, maybe more sort of Cartesian notion. And I think it would be nice to enrich the notion of collocation with this sort of interpersonal and so on. And I think that will probably also help with, so one of the reasons I picked omnipresence is it's kind of more austere as a notion. Whereas things like the Incarnation, real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, indwelling of the Holy Spirit maybe in particular, do seem to have more of this interpersonal flavour. And so, yeah, as things develop, I want to try and bring that aspect in too. But I'm just trying to start off with the more austere version before building in slightly more complicated. And thank you for the suggestion. I'll follow that up. Thanks.
Okay, thanks for your talk. It was very enjoyable. Just a quick question about a puzzle that seems to arise if you allow for something to be co-located in many places, as God is, but also think of co-location as having being defined in terms of zero distance, right? So I'm not sure it's especially deep, but it may be food for thought. So if you allow that, take the case where you've got two distinct objects, A and B, on different sides of the room. A is co-located with region A star, B with region B star. There's a very clear sense in which, because A isn't at zero distance from B star, A isn't co-located with B star, no problem. But now you have God which is co-located with A star and with B star. Because God is co-located with B star over there, we want to say he's at zero distance from it. But because he's co-located with A star on the other side of the room, there seems a very clear sense in which God is at more than zero distance from at least one of those regions. I think the solution will come from relativizing property and relation instantiations to regions. But
yeah, okay, thanks. So one solution would be to do that. I think, so I was anticipating a slightly different twist at the end. So the reason I said the stuff about transitivity was to avoid a different version of a different different problem. Maybe a different version of the same problem, but maybe not. Because it's certainly not going to be the case that just because God is co-located with something over here and something over here, those two things are co-located with each other or at zero distance from each other. But your question's slightly different. It's about, well, if God is co-located with this, and this bears a distance relation to this, doesn't that mean that God also bears that distance relation to this? And again, I think I want to say no. Given that I've denied transitivity, and I'm denying that spatial properties are necessarily inherited between co-located entities, I'm not sure. I understand that there's a pressure to say that distance relations in certain contexts are inherited in this way. So God, by being co-located with something over here, shares the distance relation that that has to this other region. I think that that is probably only going to be satisfied within certain domains, like the domains of regions or material objects or something. Maybe not even material objects if you think about multi-located entities. So I recognize that there might be more thinking to do here, and that it certainly sounds a bit strange at first blush. But I want to go into the details to work out whether I have to face that sort of a problem. But I think you're right, there's something puzzling in there.
I'm going to take Chair's privilege here and just jump in on that point, because I had something to add, which is, I think, closely related. I was working on the unity of consciousness a while ago, and you're probably aware in the literature on that, a lot of people talk about the relation of co-consciousness, which they want to be a primitive relation that holds between my conscious states, my auditory experience now, and my visual experiences, and doesn't hold between my auditory experiences and Mikawai's auditory experiences. And they want to use this relation to explain the divisions between different minds. And some people want to say this is a different relation to subject unity, which just means that two conscious states belong to the same subject. Now, when I was working on this, I remember puzzling over, well, is there any case where conscious states belong to the same subject but aren't co-conscious, aren't part of the same overall phenomenological field? And the only example I could think of was the same time traveler case that you used. If I were to travel back in time to half an hour ago, well, there I'd be sitting on the chair undergoing certain conscious experiences, and here I'd be undergoing a visual experience of seeing myself. And it would be the same subject, in a sense, it's me in both cases, and yet my visual experience looking at myself is not co-conscious with my auditory experiences listening to your talk over there. Now, I didn't draw the conclusion, well, okay, co-consciousness is different from subject unity, because I took the view, well, it's highly controversial whether time travel is coherent. And if we don't have an uncontroversially coherent example of a conceptual distinction, then we can't be sure the distinction's there to be drawn. Now, I have the parallel worry about this idea of something being able to be wholly present in multiple places, which I take it as the root of Alex's concern. The time-traveling case, it's controversial whether it's coherent. The universals case, the sort of Armstrongian universals, redness being wholly present in different locations, that's controversial. So I just want to ask, are there any uncontroversial examples of this happening? And if all the examples of it are controversial, how deep a worry is that, if at all?
Another good question. Yeah. Yes, the examples I've given and the examples that are typically given tend to be controversial. And I could easily give you some more and even more controversial examples, but I've got a feeling that's not going to help much. I can't think of uncontroversial examples. The question of what damage that does hinges on two things, I guess. One is the sense in which these examples are controversial. Brian Leftow has something interesting to say when he uses time travel as a model for the Trinity, where he says, time travel might not be possible, it might not be physically possible, it might not even be metaphysically possible, but it seems like it's conceptually possible. So any criticisms of the coherence of time travel or of Armstrongian universals or of various other cases needs to not only show that they're sort of metaphysically impossible, but they're conceptually incoherent. And your description seemed to me like it described a coherent scenario. Maybe a scenario that can't happen for people like us, maybe a scenario that can't happen in a world like this, but a scenario in which I can make sense of what you're saying. And that gives us at least prima facie reason for thinking that it's conceptually coherent. So I recognise there's an issue here, but I think the argumentative move that needs to comes from the opponent to this view rather than from the defender of it, because they need to show it's conceptually incoherent. And although I've read about time travel and other things a little bit, and some people do try to do that, most of the objections I find come from metaphysical or other considerations rather than conceptual ones. So, and sorry, so that was one thing that it hinges on. The other thing it hinges on is, well, how much are these examples really needed for presenting this material? They were an entry point to try and describe a notion. But if I can describe the notion coherently without any examples, that's not very helpful in explaining what's going on. But it might at least give some sense, in some sense, give a model. So, yes, more work to be done here, but I'm hoping that the weight of due diligence is on the other side rather than on the side that I'm inhabiting. But then people always say that.
Thank you. So the next question's here, then we've got two towards the back, and then I'll come back to the front and go for another round.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Martin. So X is co-located with Y if they are things that are of zero distance. And then trying to think, well, what sort of values can variables X and Y take amongst the rather all-inclusive category of things? I was helped by your discussion about how the number 3 cannot be said to be co-located with anything because it's not at zero distance because it's, as you said, non-spatial. But then when I started thinking about God, I thought, well, someone might naturally say, well, God is a non-spatial being. He's not inside space. So I wondered how this was going to work out. But you in the end, because you in the end did say that God is co-located with everything, so I take it you are going to say that God is spatial. But if God is spatial, he's a pretty odd spatial thing. I mean, that might be fine, because you're also very keen to say that despite being then, if I take your argument on, despite being spatial, he doesn't inherit, the inheritance claim fails, he doesn't inherit spatial or topological properties. Is that right? Is that the way you have I sort of configured how that would work out?
Thanks, that's helpful. Yeah, I think so. But I think I should go back and correct something I said. So okay. You're right that I said that the number 3 doesn't bear the co-location relation to anything because it's not spatial. I shouldn't have put it in those terms. I should have said it doesn't bear the co-location relation to anything because it doesn't bear any location relations, right?
And how do we kind of know it doesn't bear any location relation? Is it because it's an abstract object rather than a concrete object? Or
that was what I was thinking. I mean, nothing for me hinges on the claim that number 3 is abstract. If you wanted to make the number 3 stand in location relations and maybe even be spatial in whatever sense we construe of that, that would be fine. I was using it as an example of a way in which we might say that if there's certain objects which don't stand in location relations to regions or other objects, or co-location relations to regions or other objects, it's not that they get to be at zero distance from those things for free. So I want to draw a distinction between God and the number 3 in this sense, in that God does bear those sorts of relations, but the number 3 doesn't, on a typical understanding of the number 3's abstractness.
And if I push you to explain, and why is it that God can bear these relations but the number 3 can't, what would sort of lie behind that distinction in their capacities? Would it be that, well, one's concrete and one's abstract? I mean, so I don't...
yeah, maybe.
Okay.
Would that not be enough?
It might well be. I just was trying to sort of see where that would go.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to trap you. You seem reluctant to go down a path that I myself don't see any pitfalls awaiting for you on.
Well, that's because
you've seen pitfalls, and if you have seen them, then I haven't.
I'm just hesitant because it seems like a good question, and it's one that I haven't thought about, so I don't want to commit myself without thinking it through. But I think, yes, I want to row back from the spatial claim, but basically maintain a version of what you said about the other stuff, where spatial is replaced with something like standing in location relations, or being able to be located with respect to some other entities. Does that sound okay?
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
I've realised we're strictly meant to have ended, and I know there's about 11 questions in the room. So we're not going to get through all of them, and out of fairness, I think it would be wrong, therefore, to take more than the people who had their hands up right at the start, which is 2 people towards the back. I say that aware that there are many distinguished people with questions in the room, and I'm very sorry to cause any offence by not having your questions. We'd rather have them. Sam, you were next.
My question was actually...
Yours was asked.
The question that was just posed.
Well, we can skip that one. Yours was the next question.
Was it? Oh, yes. I was a bit confused with the time traveller example here. Is this an example of one object co-locating 2 things at the same time? Is that what was attempted with that? Yes, because to me that'd be 2 different objects. There would be the time traveller at a later time. To me, would be a different object. He has more memories, more thoughts. So
Yeah,
I'm a bit confused how that might help.
Good, thanks. Yeah, so in using that example, I'm making a number of assumptions which are controversial. One of the assumptions I'm making is that is endurance. So objects are the very same thing at different times. So I'm denying, using that example, I'm denying someone like Lewis's claim that objects are composed of temporal parts. And a temporal parts type view would fit very neatly with what you're saying, right? Where the older time traveller, the older time traveller, is strictly speaking a different thing to the baby, because they might still be both parts of one thing, but they're strictly speaking different things, just like my hand is different from my foot, even though they're both parts of me. And you know, perdurance, the temporal parts view has a lot of adherence, but it's not the only game in town. And coming back to a comment that I made earlier, we'd have to show the conceptual incoherence of the endurance view, where it's literally the very same object wholly present at different times, in order to show the conceptual incoherence of a time traveller case. Now, you might think that endurance is conceptually incoherent. That would put pressure on this particular example. But it's interesting that although philosophers, metaphysicians, seem to be fairly evenly split between a temporal parts view and an endurance view, it's normally accepted that the common sense view is the endurance view, where we are literally the very same thing at different times. And in fact, all this stuff about per-tension and end-tension is language that comes from the distinction between perdurance, temporal parts theory, and endurance. So this is the kind of spatial analogue of the temporal stuff, which comes back to an earlier question too. So yes, I think there are other ways. The older time traveller and the baby have different properties, it seems, but there are ways of dealing with that sort of case. Indeed, some of them are in the way that Alex was suggesting in a different example. So I guess my summative answer is yes, you can reject the example, but to do so you have to not just hold a position about these things, but hold that the alternative is conceptually incoherent. But you're right, that, I mean, the time travel case is puzzling. I find it puzzling.
And we're going to conclude with a final question from the doctor.
So this is related to a number of other questions that have come up, but I'm wondering if your example of collocation is actually going to be primitive in a type of Christian theology, because there's going to have to be other types of presence, and omnipresence is about something more than just collocation. And I would think that like angels or Cartesian minds, however you're going to cut that up, those are types of presence too, and the doctrine of omnipresence is supposed to cover those as well. But even if they're not abstracta, they're like the number 3, in that they don't have any spatial features, they don't have a location. So it seems that there's going to have to be a more basic way in which God can be present to those things that doesn't involve zero distance at all.
Good, thanks. Yeah. So a couple of things. That's a good question again. Good questions today. The first is that collocation as I was trying to spell it out, was philosophically primitive. That doesn't mean to say that it has to be theologically primitive. So in the kind of architecture of the model of location relations I was developing, we can define the other notions in terms of collocation, and that's what we do, and that's the sense in which it's primitive. But that doesn't mean that we might not have arguments or reasons for thinking about location and collocation which might depend on other things, theologically, for instance. But to come back to the particular question, I think, maybe you can disabuse me of this, but I think it's okay for Cartesian minds and angels to be collocated with God. Because the notion of collocation is supposed to be this generic thing of which the sort of typical relation that we understand, like exact location between a material object and a region, is a particular type. So collocation is supposed to permit a location relation between things which are not sort of present to us in that way. The trouble is, by saying that, I kind of open myself up again to the worries about the number 3 that you've raised and that Tim's raised, because, well, why can't God stand in the collocation relation to the number 3? And I guess there's 2 ways to go. One thing you can say is just, well, he doesn't, or she doesn't, and that's a brute fact. Not particularly satisfying. But it'll still be the case if we did that the number 3 wouldn't stand in any location relations, but angels and Cartesian minds and God would. Another thing you could say is, okay, no, so God does collocate with abstractor. But what's interesting about abstractor is that they only collocate with God and perhaps other abstractor, but probably not. Whereas God collocates both with abstractor and with concreta. And that's in the sense in which God's relationship to concreta is different from abstract objects' relationship to concreta. None of them are the number 3 is not collocated with the chair, but God is, because God and the chair bear a location relation, whereas the number 3 and the chair don't. Does that help? A bit, maybe, or maybe not at all. Okay.
I'm afraid I know there are several more questions in the room, and there might be room for even more discussion on that point. If you would like to discuss the topic of this evening's talk further, then please do join us for another glass of wine and some nibbles. We can hang around and chat for a bit longer. Just before I ask you to thank our speaker again, I neglected at the beginning to express our gratitude to the sponsors of this event, to the John Templeton Foundation, to the theology faculty, and of course the Ian Ramsay Centre here at the University of Oxford, also to Blackfriars Hall at the University of Oxford, and to the I'm coming to it, and to the philosophy faculty, the Institute of Philosophy rather, at the University of Warsaw. With that duty dispatched, may I please invite you to thank once again our speaker, Martin Pickup. Thank you very much.